Chapter 3. Quantum Weirdness. Zethusela stood resolutely before Zitalia's throne table, apparently still very determined to plead the case for his proposal, in spite of her seemingly immutable rebuttal.
But my queen, please try to see it from my point of view. As a scientist and technologist, surely you could not expect me to be anything other than profoundly impressed with the depth of the doctor's knowledge in relation to biological neural networks. The more we talked, the more convinced I became that a collaboration between the two of us presented a truly unique opportunity, and one that I was morally obligated to bring to your attention. Please, my queen, I desperately need you to believe me when I tell you that his unique set of skills could prove to be of tremendous benefit to my own particular field of research.
Queen Zitalia gave the Shihari scientist an exasperated glare.
The doctor is already a very busy arachnid, Zethusela. Honestly, this should already be perfectly self-evident. But let me spell it out to eliminate any chance of further confusion. You are now part of an exclusive list of clientele, and as such, Zikatika's sole duty is to the care of every Shihari elite on that list, yourself now included. And that, Zethusela, should be his one and only duty, notwithstanding any other specific assignments that I myself might deem fit to task him with. Now then, have I finally managed to make myself clear?
Zethusela, apparently not yet completely kowtowed, continued to maintain a doggedly plaintive expression.
It's not that I don't appreciate your perspective, my queen. Yet you yourself have said on many occasions just how critical my work on artificial intelligence might yet prove to be for the future survival and success of the nest. So all I'm trying to say here is that a collaboration with the good doctor, even if only for a single hour a day, may have a profoundly positive impact on my work, and therefore on the nest. Or should I say your nest?
Zethusela, upon observing that his words appeared to be having at least some measure of impact on the queen, pushed on earnestly.
Now I know we don't exactly agree on very much, but one thing we do both agree on is the importance of my work. It was on that basis, then, that I decided to mention this proposal directly to Dr. Zikatika himself. It should not come as any great surprise to learn that he flatly declined any form of collaboration. The bottom line is, without your official endorsement, it's simply never going to happen. Please, I am begging you, my queen. Just give me a chance, and I promise that you will not be disappointed.
Zitalia stared into the pathetically pleading eyes of her maverick scientist, weighing him up carefully. His expression told her that this was something he did indeed want very badly, and that, of course, equaled leverage, which was never a bad thing. Especially when it came to a Zihari like Zethusela, who by her own estimation was about as close to a lost cause as you could possibly get, saved only by his infuriatingly indisputable brilliance. Well, it was true enough that if this collaboration actually did yield some sort of notable progress in his field of artificial intelligence research, then by definition it would also mean progress towards a fifth-generation she-bot, which in turn would be a tremendous windfall for the nest. And of course, it would also bring her one step closer towards the ultimate unspoken, verging on heretical goal that could transform the entire face of Zicadian society forever. Still keeping her eyes firmly fixed to the squirming scientist, she held a hand imperiously up into the air and then snapped her fingers sharply. A Zimatiri body slave seemed to almost instantly materialize out of thin air.
Get me Dr. Zikatika on a Priority 1 holographic immediately.
The servant started to feverishly tap away at a comslink wrapped around one of their forelimbs, and within seconds, a life-sized, three-dimensional image of Zikatika lit up the floor in front of them. It appeared that the doctor had not yet realized that he was now in a holographic conference call and was still fully preoccupied with some sort of hideous-looking surgical procedure. After a brief but very awkward moment, Zikatika suddenly became acutely aware that he was no longer alone.
By the shadow of Eclades, what is the meaning of this outrageous interruption?
Not a good time, Doctor.
The queen asked rhetorically. Zikatika, apparently only able to partially restrain himself, offered a recklessly blunt response.
Unless you consider a multi-brain corpus callosum reunification, no big deal, then yes, my queen. Not at all. A good time.
Zitalia's mandibles twitched with bemusement.
Well then, for the sake of your patient, I do rather hope that this conversation won't take very long, but that will of course mostly depend on you, and whether or not you are willing to cooperate. But since this is obviously such a bad time, let's get straight to the point, shall we?
I'm listening.
Shikatika replied tersely.
So to business then. It has recently been brought to my attention that one of my most senior Shihari scientists, the one standing right in front of you in fact, very graciously approached you about a possible research collaboration, to which you allegedly expressed a strong reluctance to accept. Now, are you able to confirm or deny this rather disturbing accusation?
Shikatika's mandibles flared wide with unconstrained outrage.
But my queen, I must strongly protest. It has always been the case that the Zikatika line of doctors enjoy a unique relationship with your royal majesty. To state the blazingly obvious, I have only one very specific role in life, which is to solemnly serve the medical needs of the Shihari elite. There is simply no other duty that I either can or should accept, unless, of course, such a request should come directly from the Queen herself.
Ah, I see.
Zitalia replied performatively, barely concealed amusement evident in her voice.
And who do you suppose that it is you are talking to right now?
Shikatika's mandibles started to vibrate with outraged indignation.
But really, my queen, this is most unfair. I was not talking to you when the proposal was first made, but to Zethusela himself. The very same scientist that stands beside you now, like some kind of cowardly mute, who apparently needs his mother to fight all his battles for him. The fact of the matter is, his request was made in a most unorthodox and unofficial fashion. So how could I have done other but decline such a dubious proposition?
Oh, come now, Doctor. I thought that we wanted to keep this conversation brief, which is far more likely if we also keep it civil. So, notwithstanding Zethusela's lack of orthodoxy, a criticism that I'm more than inclined to agree with, I am nevertheless very much endorsing a collaboration between the two of you, and with a time commitment on your behalf of not less than 25%. Now you can either continue to debate the issue ad nauseum, which may or may not go well for your patient, but which I can assure you will most definitely not go well for you. Or you can simply agree to the terms and we can all end this conversation amicably, right here and now. So what's it going to be, Doctor?
Zikatika let out a defeated sigh.
But of course, my queen. I'd be both delighted and honoured to collaborate with an esteemed Zihari scientist of Zethusela's fame and notoriety. Now, is there anything else I can do to help, or can I finally get back to my patient?
Zitalia sat back on her throne table, with an extremely satisfied expression on her face.
Well, see now? That wasn't so difficult, was it? And yes, by all means, please do get back to that minor cosmetic surgery, which your very detailed online booking portal says you're currently scheduled to perform.
Without waiting for a response, the Queen dismissively snapped her fingers, and the holographic image of the doctor quickly faded out.
All right, Zethusela, it looks like you've got your collaboration for now anyway, but you will of course remember to keep me fully apprised of your progress. So then, are we done here? Or must I waste yet more of my precious time cleaning up after every single little mess you leave behind you?
Zikatika had barely completed his final consultation for the day before Zethusela scuttled enthusiastically through the large oval doors of the clinic's main entrance. The young scientist was just about to start speaking, but the doctor hurriedly caught Zethusela's eye and quickly placed a digit to his mandibles before pressing a small button hidden behind the front desk. The entire facility's lighting immediately took on a slightly colder shade of blue, and a soft electrical hum filled the air.
Seriously, Doctor? Cowardly mute, and getting my mother to fight all my battles. Don't you think that maybe you might have laid it on just a little bit too thick?
Shikatika waved one of his forelimbs into the air dismissively.
I strongly suspect that I know the Queen's boundaries a good deal better than you, Zethusela. At least compared to your own demonstrably abysmal track record, anyway.
The doctor's curmudgeonly rebuke appeared to do very little to dampen the scientist's rather upbeat demeanor. Shikatika, however, remained a good deal more circumspect.
Please be careful, Zethusela. We play a very dangerous game. If the Queen ever finds out about the true nature of our collaboration, we will be left with little other option than to dispose of the remaining viral reserve and then dispose of ourselves while we're at it. Unless, that is, you think you will be able to endure a lifetime of unimaginable pain and torture without revealing anything about what you've come to learn.
In spite of their successful manipulation of the Queen, Zethusela made a conscious effort to dampen his enthusiasm. The doctor was right, of course. The stakes were very high, and it was not yet too late for him to pull out.
Well, when you put it like that, Doctor, I feel somewhat obliged to point out that apart from the existence of the viral sample itself, I know very little about what is actually going on here. So if I were a much wiser arachnid, I might be well advised to keep it that way.
Zethusla immediately raised his forelimbs up in a placating gesture.
But your point is well made, and you will get no argument from me. I agree entirely that the stakes could not be higher, and I am not unaware of the significant risk you have taken, Dr. Shikatika, in bringing me in on this alleged discovery of yours.
The doctor sighed heavily.
You are only here now because you stole records that you had no business being in possession of in the first place. No, I rather think you found your own way here, Zethusla, and all I did was unlock the door and then leave it slightly ajar.
Entrapment, I believe they call it.
Zethusla replied very pointedly.
And on that particular note, might I ask, does anyone else actually know about the existence of this most ancient and venerable viral sample?
Shikatika looked startled by the question.
Apart from Queen Zitalia herself, no, not a soul. Say what you like about the Queen, but she certainly knows how to keep a secret. Ever since its original extraction, allegedly undertaken by my ancient forebear Zikatika 1020, only the Zikatika lineage have ever been made privy to its existence, and even then only the chosen few, who were trained from birth to become specialist Sihari doctors, and thus to be trusted with the ongoing research of the virus. This may well be the first time ever that the Queen has so badly miscalculated the measure of one of her Zikatika line of physicians. So I suppose then that I should actually be congratulated for my seemingly almost unique ability to deceive Her Royal Highness. The bottom line is she trusts me implicitly, and I should very much like to keep it that way.
Zethusla was right on the verge of asking about certain secretive but persistent rumors surrounding the Zikatika lineage, but it now seemed all too apparent that the good doctor had never heard any of them. So the young scientist decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor and chose to hold his tongue. The doctor continued to speak with a notably more upbeat demeanor.
But we waste precious time with needless chatter. Assuming you choose to stay, you can start by reading up on the historic research already done by my forebears, which I'm very sorry to say amounts to little more than a single page of useful, if rather fantastically difficult-to-believe information.
Zikatika now wordlessly led Zethusla into the Central Research and Operations Theater, returning him to the primary operating console that he had first used when performing the upgrade.
Go ahead and log yourself in with that fancy new biometric tech of yours. There's a new network-isolated database set up exclusively for your access. I've shadow-copied the relevant files into it from another hidden offline system that you've never seen, and if you know what's good for you, never will.
The doctor hesitated for a brief moment, and then, in spite of his much smaller stature, firmly grasped the scientist's forelimbs with his own, squaring him up so that they stood face to face.
Now listen to me very carefully, Zethusla. Considering your particular field of expertise, I would rather hope that this does not need to be said, but just in case it does, I'll say it anyway. This hidden system should only ever be accessed by me. Primarily because those are the only audit logs we want Zitalia to ever find there, understand?
The doctor's unflinching gaze held fast to Zethusla's with a vice-like grip.
And before you get any clever ideas, those audit logs are completely tamper-proof, with multiple real-time off-site backups. Any logs that do actually get created should never be time-matched to our research sessions, in order to avoid leaving behind any circumstantial evidence that might hint at the true nature of our collaboration. In other words, Zethusla, don't go poking around where you don't belong. Got it?
The Shihari scientist wasted no time getting himself logged into the doctor's specially prepared secure database and quickly went through the pitifully small amount of available research material related to what had been officially named the Queen-Activated Viral Agent, or QAVA for short. Rather disappointingly, what little was already known genuinely defied any attempt at rational interpretation. In fact, even claiming it was a virus at all amounted to little more than a highly speculative, unproven hypothesis. Only the circumstantial evidence of its infectious-like behavior even remotely supported such a claim, so in reality, the best that could be said, based on the research notes, was that it was a fluid like goo, with potentially transmissive properties, but which remained infuriatingly impervious to any amount of investigative probing. Almost inconceivably, it did not appear to be constructed of any known fundamental elements, and in fact did not demonstrate any atomic-like structure at all. No amount of magnification revealed it to be anything more than a completely smooth, featureless goo. The QAVA, or quantum goo, as Zethusela had taken to calling it, had apparently demonstrated its perplexing ability to resist any type of molecular phase transition. The fact, stranger than fiction, was that it did indeed possess the capacity to remain a superfluid, even in the vacuum of space. Yet bafflingly, in spite of its apparent indifference to freezing temperatures or intense photonic radiation, exposing it to any living neural network would see it quickly absorbed before disappearing without a trace. The infected network's mass and volume, however, remained completely unchanged, and appeared to be entirely unaffected by the quava in both form and function. It was a disappearing act of truly monumental proportions, and again defied any attempt at an even remotely rational explanation. Yet as incredible as all of this information undoubtedly was, assuming it was actually true, and not just some sort of epic prank being played on him by the doctor, it still did nothing to further Zethusela's understanding of how this virus facilitated the transfer of consciousness from one brain and into another. Or at least, that is, until now.
So, now that you are fully up to speed, allow me to share my remarkable discovery.
The doctor said somewhat melodramatically.
The viral reserve as it stands today is down to about 25% of what it was when first collected. Clearly then, the volume used in further testing now needs to be reduced to the bare minimum, while still representing a viable sample. But of course your guess is as good as mine as to what a viable sample actually means. Up until now, not a single attempt to demonstrate any interesting capability associated to this so-called virus has ever been successfully demonstrated. To better conserve what I still had left, I decided to see how far I could go in splitting a given volume into ever smaller amounts. I simply divided the sample in half, returned one portion back to the original reserve, and resplit the remainder. I proceeded to rinse and repeat until I hit the limits of our current available technology. What I ended up with were 2 samples with about the mass of a neutron. I placed each of these samples into their own micro syringe mixed with a small amount of distilled water. For test subjects, I decided to settle on 2 factory-farmed bloodworms, which I freely concede are in possession of only a very rudimentary neural net, but network nonetheless. I injected each worm with the quantum-sized Carver sample, and then went ahead and killed one at random. Of course, I didn't expect anything to actually happen, so was beyond shocked when the surviving worm immediately went into a catatonic state. It remained that way for about 1 hour, after which it seemed absolutely normal in every respect.
The doctor made a suppressing gesture with his palms to preempt any questions from the scientist.
Yes, I know exactly what you must be thinking. How could I possibly be able to differentiate the mind of one bloodworm from another? It certainly seemed as if there was a transfer of consciousness, but I had no actual proof of it, beyond the fact that it appeared to go through the same catatonic trance as a regenerating queen. Rather fortuitously, though, there actually is a way.
To the doctor's pleasant surprise, Zethusela did not attempt to interject, which allowed him to continue uninterrupted.
As it turned out, the solution to this dilemma was almost too simple. I acquired 2 fresh bloodworms, let's call them Z and Zib, and placed them into their own unique maze, each with the reward of a small puddle of blood at the end. Over a period of days, both worms got to learn the layout of their respective maze sufficiently well that they knew exactly where to go without making any mistakes. I then infected them with a quantum-sized Carver sample, and after much indecision and deliberation, decided to eat Sib. Now then, after Z had recovered from its catatonic state, I placed it in Sib's maze, and waited with bated breath to see what would happen.
Dr. Sikatica now fell to an almost deafening silence.
Well, what happened?
The scientist demanded in obvious frustration.
Not much, I'm afraid to say. It appeared that I had grossly overfed the bloodworm, so it simply could not be bothered traversing the maze.
With a mildly guilty expression, Sikatica quickly moved on.
But I'm very happy to report that once it did finally regain its appetite, it sped its way through the maze without even one single mistake.
The 2 arachnids just stared wordlessly at each other for a very long moment. Sikatica finally broke the silence.
So then, any initial thoughts as to how this mechanism might actually work? Nearly identical, or at least very similar experiments, have been conducted by my forebears over many generations past, and none of them have yielded a result even remotely like this, or any result at all for that matter. So all I can really say is that something very weird is happening when things get small, as in quantum small.
Zethusela's expression quickly changed, as if his mind had suddenly been transported to some faraway place. It was very clear to Zikatika that all 7 brains of the Shihari scientist had gone into overdrive. In a surprisingly short amount of time, his eyes came back into sharp focus, a look of revelation written all over his face.
All right, Doctor. As it so happens, I actually do have a hypothesis. Are you ready to have your mind blown?
Zikatika looked mildly satisfied, if not entirely convinced, that such a thing was in any real danger of occurring.
But my dear young Zihari, that was rather the whole point of letting you in on all of this to begin with. So please, by all means, feel free to give it your best shot.
All right then, challenge accepted. I'm going to suggest that what you stumbled upon was a peculiar form of quantum entanglement, which you unwittingly triggered when you broke the virus into portions that became sufficiently small enough to be governed by the impenetrable laws of quantum mechanics. In effect, what you created was an entangled pair of quantum goo that thus shared a single wave function. As a consequence of your most fortuitous discovery, I believe we are now in a much better position to understand the mechanics of what actually happens when a celestial queen is reborn. But before I go any further, I'd like you to perform a simple experiment in order to verify whether or not I'm on the right track.
Really? What exactly did you have in mind?
The doctor asked quizzically.
Just this. Create an entangled pair of Carver particles and then bring them back together. I'm assuming, of course, that this is something you've not yet done.
Really? Just that? Well, let me think. It's fair to say that after each division, I always return 1/2 back to the original reserve, so technically speaking, your assumption is correct. I have never actually done what you are asking, either knowingly or otherwise. I suppose we should get right onto it then.
Zikatika and Zethusela both watched the holographic image of the 2 tiny entangled particles with a growing sense of frustration. Bringing them back together had turned out to be unexpectedly difficult, as it required a precision of movement that appeared to be pushing the available micromanipulation tools to their absolute limit.
It's just no good.
Zethusela exclaimed irritably, having apparently reached the limits of his patience.
For Zikadia's sake, Doctor, stop being so stubborn and just bring the artificial intelligence unit back online, so we can finally be done with this.
The doctor gave Zethusela a disapproving glare.
So let me get this straight. You are actually proposing that we expose our work to an autonomous proto-sentient AI. Well, that sounds like a really great idea, because who knows what hidden logs, messages, and secret backdoor APIs such a system might expose us to. Or am I missing something here, Zethusela?
The scientist's mandibles contorted with frustration.
Oh, come now, Doctor. If I actually thought it represented any genuine risk, I would never have suggested it in the first place. I've disabled every conceivable outgoing interface with the network, so it's strictly one-way traffic only. You have my word.
Right. And of course you've seen every single line of code, and there is absolutely no way that you could possibly have missed anything. No, Zethusela, we don't take any risks, no matter how small. At least, not if you actually intend to keep researching the Quava on my watch.
Zethusela's face became a mask of barely repressed rage, and for just the tiniest moment, Zikatika thought the large Zihari spider might actually resort to violence. In the postmodern era, it was all too easy to forget that while the Zihari were primarily celebrated for their intellect, they were likewise historically renowned for their spontaneous acts of breathtaking brutality.
All right. Have it your own way, Doctor. But for the love of Zikadia, give me back the controls, will you? I don't mean to be rude, but the simple fact of the matter is I'm a lot younger than you, so surgeon's hands or not, I'm far better suited to this particular type of work.
Zikatika, who was seated on a wheeled chair table, irritably pushed himself back away from the operations console.
Please, Zethusela, be my guest. But unless I'm very much mistaken, I only took over in the first place because you yourself scuttled away from the console in abject frustration after nearly 2 hours of getting absolutely nowhere.
As it turned out, nearly 2 more hours of fruitless endeavor passed by before the Shihari scientist finally got the two particles back together, just as the doctor was about to call an end to the session, as he had a heavy workload booked in for the following day.
I knew it.
Zithusula declared triumphantly.
You knew what exactly?
Shikatika asked plaintively, as by this stage he had lost most of his initial enthusiasm for the experiment.
Annihilation, my good doctor, annihilation. Come, take a look at this. No, not the holographic. The particles are gone now anyway. But look at the surface where they had been located, under optical magnification.
The doctor took a careful look through the microscope's lens, and was shocked to see there were clear signs of damage to the surface of the plated disc. Considering their relative size, this was like a high-energy explosive round had detonated at the point of contact. Shikatika lifted his startled gaze in order to meet the eyes of the scientist.
And this was a prediction consistent with your hypothesis?
It certainly was. I'm now going to propose that the mother injects the daughter with an antimatter-like variation of this entangled viral agent, which goes straight to the neural network in the Virgin Queen's brain. What happens next is the daughter's stinger is activated by an autonomic response, which now has the blueprint for manufacturing this particular variant of the quantum goo.
Shikatika shook his head incredulously. It was a lot to take in. But the fact of the matter was scientific research relating to the Queen's regeneration mechanics had for most of circadian history been strictly taboo, and as such remained largely shrouded in mystery. The doctor returned a still very skeptical gaze onto the young scientist.
Can I assume, then, you have an even vaguely rational explanation for such a fantastical proposition?
Zithusula looked completely taken aback by the question.
Well, of course I do. And surely you can see it too, Doctor. It's clearly no mere coincidence that the mother invariably dies right at the beginning of the regeneration cycle, and now we have clear evidence as to exactly why. Once the entangled particles enter the mother's brain, it's lights out. Please, go ahead and repeat the experiment if you feel you need further convincing.
After a brief moment of uncomfortable silence, Zithusula continued to plead his case.
What I'm trying to say here, Doctor, is that what the daughter produces is an exact replica of what she was infected with, and as we have both just witnessed, will cause catastrophic annihilation if reunited with its original counterpart.
Dr. Shikatika said nothing, but just slowly shook his head from side to side in apparent disbelief.
Look, Doctor, I know I'm joining a lot of seemingly disparate dots in order to create a coherent picture of what I think might possibly be going on. And yes, there remain many unanswered questions, so cautious skepticism is certainly more than warranted. But please just try to keep an open mind, will you?
The doctor gave the scientist an apologetic, almost pitying look.
I don't quite know what to tell you, Zithusula. It just all seems so far-fetched. Although I have to admit that the fact that the Queens can do what they do at all is itself scarcely believable. Well, if nothing else, your hypothesis certainly deserves to go into the pantheon of crazy ideas that, at the very least, don't require divine intervention.
Listen to me very carefully, Dr. Shikatika. No one has ever observed what form the carver takes when it is ejaculated from the Queen's stinger. But if by some miracle we were ever able to actually witness the process, I believe that what we would see, or more to the point not see, is a spray of discrete subatomic entangled particles. You wanted to know my hypothesis, and that is exactly what I'm giving you. So should I continue or not?
Shikatika's posture seemed to visibly deflate, and a resigned expression slowly washed across his face.
Well, I've managed to make it this far, so I suppose it would be a shame not to hear how your fantastical little story ends. Please, by all means, feel free to put me out of my misery.
As you wish. But please, Doctor, try to contain your enthusiasm, will you?
Zithusula replied sullenly, sounding more than a little put out.
So, anyway, as I was trying to explain to you previously, the Silectile Queen dies, causing a collapse of the wave function, at which point her entire neural map, right down to the last synaptic pathway, is transmitted through a non-local hidden dimension from her brain and into the daughter's. This results in the entangled quantum goo falling out of its superposition, triggering the Kuiva to re-engineer the Zilinian Queen's neural net into the exact image of her own mother's. And there we have it. A Selectile Queen is reborn.
Well, when you put it like that, I wonder why I never thought of it myself.
the doctor said with a sarcastic tone that trailed off into abject disappointment.
But regardless of how close to the truth you actually are, it does at least seem all but indisputable. The mysterious mechanics of the quantum goo really does happen at the quantum level.
Shikatika now looked as if he had just bitten into something distastefully bitter.
And I suppose that in itself makes a certain amount of sense, because quantum mechanics defies any attempt at a truly rational interpretation. I must admit it's a field of research that has never held even the remotest interest for me, if only because I've seen it turn otherwise completely respectable scientists into little more than blathering, hand-waving idiots.
The doctor suddenly looked aghast.
Present company accepted, of course.
Of course.
Zethusela parroted back absent-mindedly. Very clearly, he was far too preoccupied with his own thoughts to be even remotely offended by any implied slur, either real or imagined, against his own particular field of expertise.
Well, it's getting rather late, Zethusela. If we don't stop now, there will scarcely be any reason for me to close the clinic before it is time to open up again. When we are both sufficiently rested, then we can discuss where to from here. In all honesty, both in light of my original discovery and what you have subsequently now hypothesized, many possible implications need to be carefully considered. I think it remains very much an open question as to whether or not this knowledge can be used in any truly productive way, or indeed, whether it should ever be used at all.
Before Zethusela could offer any response, Zikatika placed a digit to his mandibles and made his way back to the main desk. A few moments later, the lighting returned to normal, and the pervasive hum that the scientist had forgotten was there, quickly faded into an eerie silence. After bidding the doctor a reluctant farewell, Zethusela wearily left the clinic and slowly scuttled his way along the virtually deserted catacomb of tunnels and towards the nearest central exchange. He found himself idly wondering how exactly the original viral sample had been collected from the great Queen Ziana. The official historical records clearly stated that she died valiantly during the invasion of her nest. Yet if that was actually true, then the viral sample could not possibly have been hers. He had to wonder if this was all just some kind of fantastical dream, as quite remarkably all you apparently needed was a single entangled fragment of this mysterious molecule to map an entire brain, albeit in this particular case, a rather simple one. Clearly then they would need to test something a good deal more sophisticated than a bloodworm, but that of course presented a serious moral dilemma. 2 test subjects go in, but only one comes back out, and that represented a massive ethical hurdle Zethusela would simply not be able to overcome. Yet another reason, then, why the Queen must never know about this breakthrough, the scientist thought to himself grimly. Well, was there any way forward from here, or had they already hit the end of the road? Just maybe there actually was. Rightly or wrongly, generic Zixolotl clones, all grown from the same base DNA, were an accepted part of modern Zicadian medicine. Clones grown in tanks, and never to achieve consciousness, at least not legally, were routinely used for body parts in contemporary society. Their minds, however, never saw the light of day. Zixolotls were treated purely as a commodity. Depending on what was harvested, the clone would eventually reach end of viability and would thus inevitably be taken off life support. Could not such a clone now have their brain harvested by this mysterious quantum goo, unburdened of any ethical dilemma? But where exactly would you put it? Into another Zixolotl, the scientist pragmatically supposed. And what would that actually achieve? Well, what about acting purely as a receptor? The direction of transfer, after all, seemed to be simply a matter of which infected party died first. And unlike the Queen's, there appeared to be no issue of immunity to contend with. So let's imagine a terminally ill Zimatiri, their brain transferred to a perfectly healthy clone. That worked, but it was laughable to think this was the type of benevolent use that a queen would want to put a discovery like this to, especially given their legal obligation to strictly control population growth. Zethusela's mind continued to wander through a veritable wonderland of possibilities, as if he was walking through a mysterious garden oasis. He vaguely noticed that he was now sitting in a public transit pod, which seemed to be going in the right direction, but he could not for the life of him remember how he had managed to get here. So, what would happen then if you tried to put a 7-brained Shihari like himself into a single-brained Jixalotl clone? Would the brain multiply itself into the required number? Very unlikely. They needed to do further experiments on the bloodworms, damage or lobotomize the brain of one of the test subjects, then transfer the mind of the other one into it and see what happens. Would it still be mentally impaired? So many perplexing possibilities. What if you tried to transfer the brain of a bloodworm into a mesaline starfly? Zethusela suddenly felt very tired, so he reluctantly decided to try and let 4 of his brains fall to sleep, while the other 3 continued to ponder over the seemingly endless list of mysteries unfolding. However, sleep simply would not come. The itch that could not be scratched was how did all of this fit into his own personal objectives? Perhaps it was only because he was so tired that he found himself asking the seemingly ridiculous question of whether or not you could infect an artificially constructed neural net. Now, he definitely wasn't going to get any sleep. His mind inevitably cycled back to the rather perplexing question of how exactly had they secured the kava from Queen Siana all those millennia ago. He would have to ask Zikatika, but he seriously doubted the good doctor would have the slightest clue. Very likely the only arachnid left alive who still knew the truth was Queen Zitalia herself. Zethusela suddenly sat bolt upright as a rather startling thought sprung unbidden into his mind. He promptly decided that he would keep such wildly heretical speculation strictly to himself, lest he risk pushing Dr. Zikatika beyond his limits. Hand-waving, indeed.